He didn't look like someone who belonged there. But then again, neither did I. That's the thing about rock bottom, it doesn't look the same on everyone, and it rarely announces itself the way you expect. I had been at the Millward Street shelter in Cincinnati for 11 days. 11 days of metal cots, shared bathrooms, the particular smell of a building that held too many struggling people too close together. 11 days of trying to hold my dignity in both hands like something that kept slipping. I was 43 years old. I had worked for 20 years in restaurant management. I had owned a small place of my own for 6 of those years, a neighborhood spot called Grover's, named after my father. We served breakfast and lunch. We were full most mornings. I knew my regulars by name and by order. Then came the year that took everything. A water main broke under the street outside. Construction blocked our entrance for 4 months. Then a rent increase I couldn't negotiate down. Then the kind of debt that compounds quietly until it doesn't. I lost Grover's in February. I lost my apartment in April. By May, I was at Millward Street, in a bed near the window, trying to figure out what came next. The man sat down beside me on a Thursday evening. He was maybe 60. Plain clothes. Quiet. He didn't say a word. My name is Nadia. I want to say that clearly because it matters. Not as a resume, not as a list of what I had and lost, but as a person with a name who made something real and then watched it disappear and had to figure out how to keep being herself after. I grew up in Cincinnati. My father, Grover, had worked in restaurant kitchens his entire adult life, never owning one, always somewhere between the line and the manager. When I was 12, he told me that someday he was going to have his own place. He never did. He died at 61, still working someone else's kitchen. I opened Grover's when I was 33. It took everything I had. I got a small business loan and a second job for the first 2 years to cover the gap. I put my father's photograph on the wall behind the register. I taught myself to bake the cornbread from his recipe, written in his handwriting on a card I still carry in my wallet. The restaurant meant something beyond business. It was the thing I had done for him. Losing it had taken something from me that the numbers didn't capture. At Millward Street, I kept to myself mostly. I was polite to the staff, quiet with the other residents. I spent my days at the library, using their computers to look for work, for housing, for anything that resembled a next step. I was tired in the way you get tired when the exhaustion isn't just physical. The shelter had a common room at the back. Rows of plastic chairs, a television mounted high on the wall that played the news on a loop, a table with a coffee urn that was always either empty or barely warm. Most evenings, people gathered there after dinner, not necessarily because they wanted company, but because the alternative was lying on a cot staring at the ceiling. I usually sat near the window. I had a spot that I had claimed by habit, the chair that got the last of the afternoon light through the glass, which in May meant there was sometimes 40 minutes of warmth before it faded. That Thursday, I was sitting in my usual spot with a notebook. I wrote lists. Things I still had. Things I needed. Steps I was going to take. It helped me feel less like I was drifting. The man sat down in the chair next to mine without asking, without announcing himself, without the slightly theatrical diffidence that some people adopt in shelters when they're not sure of the social codes. He simply sat. He was wearing dark trousers and a plain gray pullover. His shoes were good, I noticed this, because I noticed shoes from years of restaurant work, where you stand for 12 hours and your footwear becomes existential. He was well made but old. Comfortable old. He looked at the television. He said nothing. I looked at him briefly and went back to my list. He came back the next evening. Same chair. Same quiet. He had a cup of the bad coffee, black, no complaint about the temperature, and he watched the news with the expression of someone who has seen enough of the world that news rarely surprises them. I was in my usual spot again. My notebook was open but I wasn't writing. I was thinking about a phone call I'd had that afternoon, a property management company with a room available, more than I could afford, the kind of call that gives you a glimpse of a door that isn't open for you yet. After maybe 20 minutes, without turning to look at me, the man said, "You write lists?" "Yes," I said. "Does it help?" "Some days more than others," I said. He nodded. He looked back at the television. That was the whole conversation. But it was something. In a place where most interactions are either formal or fraught, the simplicity of it felt like a kind of courtesy. On the third evening, I learned his first name. Not because he introduced himself but because one of the shelter staff passed through and greeted him, "Evening, Frank," in the way you greet someone you've seen enough times to have crossed into the familiar. "Frank." I filed it away. On the fourth evening, I told him my name without being asked. He repeated it once, quietly, as if making sure he had it right. Then we both looked at the television. By the second week, we talked more. Not deeply at first. Practical things. He asked what I had done before. I told him about Grover's, the basics, the breakfast service, the cornbread recipe. I watched his face while I talked about it. He listened the way good listeners do, without preparing his response while you're still speaking. I asked what he did. He said he was in business. Retired, mostly. He said it the way people say things when they're being accurate but not complete. I didn't push. You learn, in places like Millward Street, not to push. Everyone there had a before. The before was usually the part that hurt most. What I noticed about Frank was the way he existed in the space. He was not performing humility. He was not there on a visit or a project or to observe. He ate his dinner in the main hall like everyone else. He used the shared bathroom. He slept, I assumed, somewhere in the building, though I never knew where. He had no phone visible. No laptop. He read a paperback novel that he held loosely, like someone who wasn't in a hurry to finish it. One evening I asked him something I hadn't meant to ask out loud. "What are you doing here, Frank?" He looked at me. His expression was even and honest. "Remembering," he said. I didn't know what that meant yet. I let it sit. On a Tuesday evening, I had the worst day I'd had since arriving. The job application I had been most hopeful about, a restaurant manager position at a mid-sized group across town, came back with a rejection. No explanation. Just the standard message. I had tailored that application for 4 hours in the library. I had been quietly, carefully hoping. I came back to the shelter and sat in a common room with my notebook closed on my lap and did not open it. Frank came and sat beside me. He looked at my face and didn't ask what happened, because it was evident enough. He picked up his coffee cup and held it with both hands and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Tell me about the cornbread." I looked at him. "What?" "The cornbread from your father's recipe. Tell me about it." It was such an odd thing to ask in that moment that I almost laughed. Instead, I told him. I talked about the card in my wallet with my father's handwriting. The specific ratio of buttermilk to flour that made it different from most versions. The way regulars would come in just for it on Saturday mornings and stay for the eggs. Frank listened. He asked 2 specific questions, both about technique, that told me he understood cooking, at least somewhat. When I finished, he said, "That's not a recipe. That's a legacy." I looked at the closed notebook in my lap. "Yeah," I said. "It is." 3 days later, Frank wasn't in the common room. I noticed the absence the way you notice the absence of something you hadn't realized you were depending on. The chair beside mine felt like a gap. He came back the following evening. He sat down, picked up his coffee, and said, without preamble, "I've been thinking about your restaurant." "Okay," I said carefully. "Not Grover's," he said. "The next one." I looked at him. "There isn't a next one. Why not? I almost said because I have nothing left. But I stopped myself because it wasn't entirely true and Frank was the kind of person you didn't say careless things to. Because the debt from the first one is still there, I said instead. And because I don't have capital. And because, I stopped. Because it broke something, Frank said. Yes, I said. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. When I was 31, he said slowly, I lost a company. My first one. Everything I had built for 7 years. He looked at the television. It took me a long time to understand that losing it wasn't the end of the story. I looked at him. He looked at the television. What happened after? I asked. I built something else, he said. Differently. Better, I think. I didn't ask more that night. But something in me that had been facing only backward turned, just slightly, the other direction. A week later, Frank asked me a question I wasn't expecting. If you could open a restaurant tomorrow, he said, where would it be? What would it look like? I told him without thinking first, which meant I told him the real version, the one I'd been carrying in the back of my mind since losing Grover's. A place in the Over-the-Rhine neighborhood. Small. Counter service and 4 tables. Breakfast and lunch, same as before, with the same cornbread. But also a sliding scale pricing option, regulars paid full price, people who couldn't afford it paid what they could. The neighborhood needs it, I said. There are working people there who don't have anywhere decent to eat a real breakfast. Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I know the neighborhood. Lots of people do, I said. I own a building there, he said. On Vine Street. Ground floor has been empty for 2 years. I looked at him. He met my eyes with an expression that was direct and calm. Nadia, he said, I should tell you something about myself. He told me. His full name was Frank Harland. I recognized it, dimly, from business news I hadn't followed closely, a Cincinnati industrialist and philanthropist who had built and sold several companies over 4 decades. Quietly wealthy. Known for giving in ways that were deliberate and not particularly public. I sat with that for a moment. Why are you here? I asked. At Millward Street. I come every year, he said. For 2 weeks. To remember what it actually feels like to have very little. So I won't forget. He paused. I forgot once. I don't plan to go again. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of excitement, though there was some of that. But because something in me needed to be careful. I had hoped before, in practical specific ways, and hope had a cost I understood well. The next morning I found Frank at breakfast. I sat across from him and said, I need to say something. All right, he said. If you're offering what I think you're offering, space, or investment, or both, I need you to know I'm not looking for charity. I'm looking for a fair arrangement. A lease I can actually afford. A loan with real terms. Something I can build from and pay back and own the result of. Frank looked at me across the tray of shelter breakfast food. That's exactly what I had in mind, he said. Nothing else would be worth doing. 3 weeks later, I was no longer at Millward Street. I was in a small temporary rental, rebuilding my credit documentation, meeting with a local SBDC advisor about a business plan. Frank's building manager showed me the Vine Street space on a Thursday morning. It was raw and needed work. It had good bones and a wide front window that caught the morning light. I stood in the empty space and thought about my father's handwriting on a recipe card. The lease terms were fair. Better than fair, but structured as a real business arrangement. Frank's attorney and mine worked through it over 2 weeks. I signed in June. Grover's on Vine opened on a Saturday morning in October. The line was longer than I expected. A review in a local food blog had run the week before, a small piece, nothing dramatic, just an honest description of the food and the concept. Enough people came to fill the 4 tables and the counter twice before noon. The cornbread sold out by 10:15. I worked the counter myself that first day, not because I had to, but because I needed to feel it. The weight of the spatula. The sound of the room filling with people eating and talking. The particular satisfaction of handing someone a plate of food that you made with your hands and your knowledge in your father's recipe. Frank came in at 9. He sat at the counter. He ordered the cornbread and eggs and a coffee. He was the 4th customer. He ate without making a production of it. When he finished, he put cash on the counter, more than the bill, as was his habit, I would learn, and he looked around the room once, slowly. "Good," he said. That was all. He left. I watched him go and thought about 2 people sitting in plastic chairs in a shelter common room, not saying very much. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that happen mostly in silence. My father never got his restaurant. But I got mine twice. And the second time, I understood something he had always known, that the point was never the building, or the reviews, or the numbers on a lease. The point was the people sitting down, and the food made with care, and the door that stayed open. I kept that door open.